Hello everyone. Before we get started, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. That way, YouTube knows to keep sharing more stories like this with you. Now, let's jump in. I was stationed at Coast Guard Air Station Kodiak in the winter of 2022, working the night comms shift. The building was quiet that time of night. Only the low hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional creak from the metal vents above. The night watch room always had a certain stillness after midnight, the kind that made every sound feel heavier than it really was. The air outside had been below freezing all week, and the windows had a thin sheet of frost that glowed faintly under the control room lights. Most nights were uneventful, just regular check-ins, weather updates, and the occasional radio test from vessels anchored offshore. Around 2:40 a.m., the red indicator light for the distress channel started flashing. I straightened up instantly, reaching for the headset. The distress tone came through clear, a steady, pulsing alarm. And then a voice followed, broken with static, but definitely human. It was a male voice, rough, strained, like someone yelling over wind and water. The message was short. "Mayday, Mayday, this is the June Belle. We're taking on water southeast of Afognak Island." Then a burst of static cut it off. I repeated the call sign and coordinates, verifying what I'd heard. The signal was weak but consistent. It wasn't drifting, which meant it wasn't bouncing off the atmosphere. It was local. It was close. Standard procedure kicked in. I logged the call, confirmed the coordinates twice, and patched the signal through to the duty officer. Within minutes, the ready helo, an MH-60 Jayhawk, was prepped for launch. I relayed the coordinates and briefed the crew while they ran through pre-flight checks. The pilot, Lieutenant Harper, radioed in just before liftoff, his voice calm as always. "Comms, this is Rescue 6021. Lifting off en route to position southeast of Afognak. TA 20 minutes. I acknowledged and switched the feed to the main screen, tracking their position as they climbed into the dark. Once they were airborne, I replayed the distress transmission. It came through slightly cleaner on the recording. The voice was desperate but not chaotic. Someone experienced, maybe a captain. I could hear what sounded like machinery clanking in the background, and waves slapping hard against hull plates. He was shouting over it, repeating their name, their coordinates, asking for help. The weather data showed light wind, low seas, and visibility around 2 miles. Nothing that would sink a vessel quickly, unless it had struck something. By the time the helo reached the coordinates, I had a constant open line with them. The pilot reported calm conditions and a faint mist hanging just above the water. No debris, no flares, no radar contact. They circled twice. Nothing. I zoomed in on the marine radar overlay, searching for any sign of a reflection, but there was only open water. The area was completely clear. The only sound over the radio was the low hum of the rotors and Harper's voice as he scanned the surface. Then the signal came back. The same distress frequency, the same call sign, June Belle. The transmission cut through the static like a whisper pressed against a microphone. Faint at first, then sharper. Muffled voices in the background, wind and water. I could hear what sounded like shouting, but it was distant. Then, clear as day, a voice yelled through the static, "We're right here. Can you see our lights?" The tone of it sent chills down my spine. It wasn't like a recording or echo. It sounded live. I relayed the transmission to the pilot immediately. Harper responded that they saw nothing. No lights, no reflection, nothing moving on the surface. The mist had thickened and they were flying low, scanning the area with the spotlight. It illuminated the water in a pale cone, smooth and still. Not a ripple, not a hint of debris, nothing floating. The helo made another pass. Still nothing. But in the comms room, the signal continued. Short bursts of static, fragments of shouting like it was looping through half-broken transmissions. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the signal went silent. Dead quiet, I waited. Checked for interference, tried to trace the origin, but it was gone. No carrier wave, no residual ping. It was as if it had never been there. Harper's team did 2 more sweeps before heading back. When they landed, I was still listening to the empty frequency, hoping something would come through again. Nothing did. After the helo returned, I stayed to finish the incident report. Every call, every transmission, every log line had to be precise. When I typed in June Bell, the name felt familiar, like something I'd seen before. Out of curiosity, I ran the vessel registry through the Coast Guard's database. It took a minute, and then the results came up. The June Bell, a 32-foot fishing trawler out of Old Harbor, had sunk in 1994, 28 years earlier. The record showed it went down during a storm in nearly the same area, southeast of Afognak Island. 3 crew were lost. The wreck had never been recovered. I sat there staring at the screen for a long time. My first thought was a rebroadcast, an old transmission bouncing off the atmosphere, replaying after decades. It's rare, but it's happened before. Except the distress channel is line of sight VHF. It doesn't bounce off the ionosphere. It doesn't echo through time. Once a signal's gone, it's gone. I checked the frequency history again. The signal strength and clarity were too clean to be from any kind of interference. And the voice, his voice, sounded modern. Not a recording from a cassette or log replay. It had the depth and texture of a live call. Later that morning, after shift change, I went down to the archive room where they keep old SAR, search and rescue case files. The air smelled like old paper and coffee grounds. I pulled the 1994 case folder. Inside was a faded photo of the June Bell and a copy of the distress transcript from the night it sank. It was short, handwritten from the radio log. "Mayday, Mayday, this is the June Bell. We're taking on water, southeast of Afognak Island." Almost identical to what I'd heard. For a while I tried convincing myself it had to be some kind of atmospheric quirk, maybe another vessel using the same call sign without realizing it. But when I checked every active vessel on that frequency, there wasn't a single one named June Bell, and no boats reported being in that area at that time. No echoes, no overlapping signals, no interference from nearby installations. The weather radar showed stable air patterns. There was nothing that could explain it cleanly. I didn't talk much about it for the rest of that shift. The pilot filed his report and didn't add much beyond no visual contact. Everyone moved on quickly like we were supposed to, but that voice stayed with me. It wasn't just the words, it was the tone. The sound of someone certain they were being seen, calling out to people they thought were there. It was a sound of life, not a recording or a glitch. It had weight to it. A few days later, I drove out toward Pasagshak Point, where you can see across the water toward Afognak on a clear day. The ocean looked calm, almost glassy, the kind of stillness that makes it easy to forget how violent it can become. Somewhere out there, the June Bell had gone down, and somewhere around the same stretch of sea I'd heard its name called again nearly 3 decades later. I stayed parked for a while, listening to the radio in the truck. The usual chatter of fishing vessels, a few weather updates, nothing unusual. The distress channel was silent. Eventually, I stopped listening for it. But even now, every time I'm on duty and the red light flashes on the console, I feel that same cold weight in my chest. I think about that night, about the coordinates, about the calm water and that faint mist hovering over the surface. I think about the voice that sounded so alive, calling out for help from somewhere that didn't exist anymore. There's a strange thing that happens when you work comms long enough. You start to understand that not every mystery has to be supernatural to be disturbing. Sometimes the sea holds on to things, voices, echoes, signals, that come back for reasons no one can explain. Maybe it was a malfunction, maybe an unregistered boat, maybe just noise. But it doesn't matter. I still remember exactly how that voice sounded when it shouted, clear through the static. "We're right here." And I still remember looking at the radar screen, the empty blue expanse where there should have been something, anything moving. All there was that night was open water, the hum of the radio, and the faint hiss of static that lingered long after the signal had gone silent. I used to work nights at a private wildlife research lab just outside Fairbanks, Alaska. near Creamer's Field. The lab specialized in tracking migration and behavior patterns of moose, wolves, and occasionally caribou. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid well, and I liked the quiet. Most of my shifts started around 5 p.m. and went until sunrise. The lab sat on a dirt road off College Road, surrounded by black spruce and open snowfields. At night you could hear owls and sometimes wolves howling in the distance. Most of the researchers worked daytime hours, so during the night it was just me, a few computers, and the hum of the old baseboard heaters. My job was mostly data management. We had motion-triggered microphones and cameras placed at various points throughout the field preserve and along the forest edge. They ran all night, capturing audio of wildlife activity, then sent data back to the lab through a satellite link, or, if the signal was weak, stored it locally on SD cards. Every morning before sunrise, I'd review what had come in, log anything useful, and prepare the reports for the morning staff. Most nights were routine. You'd get distant moose calls, wind through trees, snow shifting, and sometimes wolves. Those were the recordings we were really after. You learned to tell them apart by sound alone. But on one particular night in early February, something different came in. I remember because the temperature had dropped to around -30 that night, and even the wolves were quiet. I was sipping from a thermos of coffee around 6 in the morning when the file came through from Unit 4B, one of our most remote recorders, located about 6 miles northeast of the main lab, near a patch of birch and frozen swampland. The file was time-stamped 3:17 a.m. Normally I would have skimmed through it like the others, but the log showed an unusually long activation, about 30 seconds of sustained motion-triggered recording. Most animal triggers lasted less than 10. I clicked play. At first there was just the faint static hum of wind, the kind you get on really still nights when the air itself seems to buzz. Then came a sound that made me lean closer. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, crunching over snow. You could clearly hear the rhythm, the pause between each step, the weight pressing into the crust before lifting again. It wasn't moose or wolf. It was human. You could tell immediately by the spacing and cadence. They moved slowly, like someone walking through deep snow, pausing now and then to listen. Then there was this faint humming sound, not mechanical, more like a low voice, almost tuneless, the kind of sound someone makes when they're trying to keep themselves calm or warm. It was muffled, but the mic picked it up clearly enough that I could tell it was a person. That went on for maybe 20 seconds. Then came another sound, something scraping or dragging through the snow. It was heavy and irregular, like a sled being pulled unevenly, or something dense being hauled behind them. It didn't sound like an animal kill. It was too smooth, too steady. I remembered turning the volume up, trying to make sense of it. Then, right near the end, a whisper came through. Not background noise, not distortion. A clear, close human whisper that said, "You shouldn't be here." Right after that, the file cut off mid-sound. No wind, no static, just dead silence. The recorder had stopped transmitting. I just sat there staring at the waveform for a while, feeling this weird cold creep up my neck. We didn't have any staff scheduled out there that night. There was no reason anyone should have been near that unit, especially in those temperatures. The terrain out that way was rough and barely accessible except by snowmobile or on foot, and our field team never went alone. I double-checked the schedule, checked the GPS logs, and saw no activity registered in that area since the unit had last been serviced about 2 weeks earlier. At first, I thought maybe it was interference, a glitch, or maybe someone trespassing. We sometimes got locals out hunting illegally, but not often that deep into the preserve. Still, I logged it as possible human interference and moved on to the rest of the files. But the whisper stuck in my head. I replayed it over and over, trying to tell if it was wind distortion or overlapping frequencies. But every time it sounded the same. A clear voice. Timid but sharp. "You shouldn't be here." That afternoon, I decided to go out and retrieve the unit myself. I wasn't required to. Usually that was done by our field staff, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. It was still below zero when I loaded the truck and headed out along the access road. The first 3 miles were easy. The snow was packed down from previous trips. Beyond that, the trail narrowed, and I had to park and go the rest of the way on snowshoes. The woods were silent except for the sound of my breathing and the faint creak of trees shifting in the cold. Every now and then I'd stop and listen, but there was nothing. No birds, no movement. It felt too still. The GPS led me to a small clearing where the recorder was mounted on a wooden post near a frozen creek bed. I saw it before I reached it and my stomach dropped. The unit wasn't upright anymore. It was lying half buried in the snow. The casing cracked open like it had been stepped on or hit with something heavy. When I brushed the snow off, I saw deep dents across the plastic, almost like boot prints, though the shape wasn't clear. Around the post, the snow was flattened, trampled in all directions, but there were no distinct tracks leading in or out. No tire marks, no clear footprints, just churned up snow, like someone or something had been moving around in circles. I crouched down, trying to piece together what could have happened. Maybe a moose had gotten curious and stomped it, though that didn't explain the whisper. The snow was too disturbed to tell. I found the SD card still inside, surprisingly intact despite the damage. So I pocketed it, packed the remains of the unit, and started back toward the truck. On the way, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following. But the woods stayed still, the only sound the crunch of my snowshoes. Back at the lab, I transferred the SD card and compared it to the transmitted file. The same audio, same cutoff point. The unit had powered down exactly at the end of that whisper. I checked the logs for errors or power failures. Nothing. It hadn't run out of battery. It just stopped. I didn't tell anyone at first. I wrote up a simple report saying the unit had been damaged, possibly by weather or animals. But that night, while I was sitting alone in the lab, I opened the file again. I listened with the volume low, the room completely silent except for the heaters. When the whisper came on, I felt every hair on my arm stand up. It wasn't the words themselves that got me. It was the tone. Whoever said it wasn't angry or scared. It sounded like a warning. Calm, almost tired, like someone who'd seen something they didn't want anyone else to see. I tried to convince myself it was just some hunter, lost and freezing, talking to himself. Maybe he'd found the recorder, realized it was running and smashed it. That was the only explanation that made sense. But the way the snow was disturbed, the lack of any tracks leading away, didn't fit. The snow that deep holds prints for weeks. Whatever happened there didn't make sense in a normal way. I turned in my notice a week later. Officially, I said I wanted to move back south, closer to family. But the truth is, after that night, I couldn't stand being in that building after dark. Every creak from the heater or scrape from the roof made me tense. I kept picturing that empty clearing, the crushed recorder, and that voice. I still have the audio file. I copied it before leaving, stored on an old hard drive that I've carried ever since. I haven't played it again in years, but I know it's there. Every once in a while I think about deleting it, but something in me won't. Maybe it's curiosity, maybe fear. Because even though I left that job, moved away, and stopped thinking about wildlife research altogether, sometimes, especially on really cold, still nights, I'll hear that same faint humming outside, just for a second, like someone out there standing still in the snow waiting. I was running a solo haul north along the Dalton Highway, late January of 2019. The route was familiar. I'd been doing it for years, but that night felt different. The cold was sharper than usual, even for Alaska. My dash read 47-degree full, and I could feel the truck straining against it. Every gear shift slower, every hiss of the air brakes echoing louder in the dead quiet. I was about 60 miles south of Deadhorse, cutting through a stretch of frozen nothingness under a full moon. The world outside was silver and still, the kind of stillness that made the engine noise sound unnatural, like it didn't belong out there. The road ahead was glassy and pale, a long ribbon of ice with snowbanks piled high on both sides. I had the high beams on, cutting through the dark as best they could, but the light just seemed to fade into the distance. It was almost 2 in the morning, and I hadn't seen another set of headlights in hours. Up there, that wasn't unusual, but it always sat wrong in my stomach. Knowing you could break down and there'd be no one around for 50 miles, not even a plow truck, makes you drive with your jaw tight and your hands locked on the wheel. The cab heater was fighting a losing battle against the cold. I kept my gloves on even inside, tapping the steering wheel to keep the blood moving. The CB had gone silent an hour back. No chatter, no voices. Just me, the hum of the tires, and the wind hissing over the mirrors. The kind of silence that eats at your nerves if you sit in it too long. I remember checking my clock. It was 2:07 a.m. And that's when I saw something in the road ahead. At first it was just a shadow. A small dark shape right at the edge of the headlights. I eased off the gas, squinting through the windshield. The reflection of the ice made everything shimmer. And for a second, I thought it might be a moose carcass or debris that fell off another rig. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't an animal. It was a person. He was kneeling in the middle of the road, both hands flat on the ice like he was feeling for something beneath it. I hit the brakes gently, not wanting to slide, and rolled to a stop about 20 feet away. My headlights washed over him, and the sight made my stomach twist. He wasn't wearing a coat, just dark clothes, thin ones too, and no hat or gloves that I could see. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his breath wasn't visible in the cold. I thought maybe it was a hallucination, some trick of the eyes after hours of driving in the dark, but then he moved. He lifted his head slowly like it took effort and turned to face me. The light hit his face square on. His cheeks were blistered white with frostbite, and his lips looked cracked and frozen. His eyes, they didn't look alive. They were cloudy, unfocused like glass. He just stared straight at me through the glare of the headlights. I sat there, not sure what to do. My instinct told me to stay in the cab. It's too cold to be outside long, and people freeze fast out there. But something about him being alone in that condition got under my skin. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the driver's door. The cold hit me like a wall, burning the inside of my nose instantly. I called out, asking if he needed help, but the wind carried my voice away. He didn't react. He just kept standing there. I took a few steps toward him, boots crunching on the hard-packed ice. My breath fogged in front of me, drifting like smoke in the beam of my flashlight. The air was so cold it felt solid in my lungs. When I was maybe 10 feet away, he turned, slow and smooth, and started walking toward the snowbank at the side of the road. Not stumbling, not running, just a steady walk, head low. I yelled again, told him to stop, but he didn't. He just walked off the road straight into the open tundra beyond the ditch. The snow out there was deep. I expected to see his legs breaking through the crust, tracks forming behind him, but there was nothing. He moved through it like the snow wasn't even there. I walked to the edge of the road and shined my light over the tundra, but the moonlight and blowing snow made it hard to see far. There was nothing but emptiness. No movement, no sound, just the wind. I stood there for maybe a minute before realizing how badly my face was starting to burn. I backed up toward the truck, scanning the area the whole time, but the man was gone. Completely. It didn't make sense. There were no footprints anywhere. Not on the road, not in the snow. Not even the faint drag marks you'd expect from someone crawling or limping. Just smooth ice and untouched snowdrifts. I felt my chest tightening. Not from fear exactly, but from confusion that bordered on panic. Things make sense out there if you've done the route long enough. You know what belongs and what doesn't. That man didn't belong. I climbed back into the cab, slamming the door and sitting there in silence for a while. The heater was still blowing weakly, and my breath fogged up the windshield. I killed the headlights for a moment, just to see if maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. But when the beams went out, the darkness pressed up against the glass so heavy it made me shiver. I turned them back on immediately. The road was empty again. Whatever I'd seen was gone. I stayed parked there for a good 20 minutes, debating whether to call it in. But what was I supposed to say? That there was a half-dead man kneeling on the ice who walked off into nothing? They'd send someone out, waste resources, and find no one. I finally put the truck back in gear and started rolling again, slow and steady, eyes glued to the edges of the light. Every snowdrift looked like a crouched figure. Every shadow seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at it. When I reached the next maintenance stop, Pump Station 4, I pulled over. The thermometer on the building read 49 degrees. I went inside to warm up and told the night guy there what I'd seen, careful with my words. He didn't look surprised. He just nodded slowly and said, "People get caught out here every winter. Some walk off the road when their rig breaks down and never come back." Then he told me about a driver from a few years back who froze to death trying to walk to a station after running out of fuel. They found him less than a mile from the road, half buried in snow. I asked if they ever found anyone matching who I described, but he said no. "Sometimes we just don't find them," he said. Snow covers everything fast. I stayed there for an hour before heading out again, but I couldn't shake it. The image of that face, white, cracked, staring up into my headlights, stuck with me. Even now, years later, I still see it when I drive north of the Arctic Circle. Sometimes I wonder if he was real, some poor trucker who wandered too far from his cab. Maybe I just saw him too late. Maybe he'd already been gone for hours or days. The highway keeps its dead quiet, buried under snow and ice, waiting until spring to give them back. Every winter since then, when I pass that stretch of the Dalton, I slow down without thinking. The road there always looks the same, flat, wide, endless. But it feels heavier somehow, like the air itself remembers. I never saw him again, and I never found any record of someone missing from that time or place. But that's how things go out there. The tundra swallows people whole, and sometimes, for a moment, it gives one back just long enough to remind you how thin the line really is between being alive and being another thing, frozen on the ice road. I worked as a field tech at Tulik Field Station, up on the north slope of Alaska, and I still think about that winter sometimes. It was late November, the sun long gone, and only a handful of us were left to close down the place for the season. The air never got above 40 degrees Celsius, and the light never rose past a dull twilight that made everything look like a frozen photograph, the kind of cold that eats at your face and makes your eyelashes stick together. The wind would blow fine snow across the tundra like smoke, and it was so silent out there that even a door creaking could make your chest tighten. We were running on reduced systems, just enough heat and power to keep the main structures from freezing solid. The rest of the station was dark, rows of empty labs, sealed dorms, silent fuel pumps, and equipment tarped over for the next spring. The last resupply plane had already left, and the next wouldn't come for months. It was just me, Dan, and one other guy, a maintenance hand named Rick, who had gone south the week before. So it was down to me and Dan to button things up. We kept the generator sheds running, checked the propane heaters, and made sure the communication equipment didn't ice over. Dan was a quiet guy, mid-30s, always smoking those little hand-rolled cigarettes out behind the storage units. He'd done a few seasons before, and he knew how to handle the isolation better than I did. I'd only been there since August, but by November the silence had gotten inside my head. Every sound seemed to carry forever, the groan of ice shifting under the snow, the rattle of metal siding, even my own breathing. It was sometime around 2 a.m. when it happened. Hard to tell time that far north, with no sun or real sense of day. I'd been making my nightly round, just a walk between the main generator shed and the fuel tank out by the fence line. The air was brutal, maybe 50 degrees with the wind. My breath froze into tiny crystals that floated around my hood like dust. The station lights cast small orange pools onto the snow, and beyond them was just endless black tundra, stretching toward nothing. When I reached the generator shed, I noticed something right away. The door wasn't shut. It was swinging slightly, creaking on the hinges. No one left doors open out there. You could lose all the heat in minutes and the equipment could freeze. I figured maybe Dan had gone out for a smoke and forgot to close it. But when I stepped inside, the air felt wrong. Too still, too quiet. Normally both generators gave off a steady rumble you could feel in your chest. But now only one was running. The main one. The backup, which we always kept on in winter, had been shut off manually. The switch was down, not tripped. Someone had turned it off. I checked the gauges. The emergency system had kicked in automatically, just like it should have, but the fuel flow was low. We couldn't run like that for long. I stood there for a moment, hearing only the faint hum of the active generator and the distant whine of the wind outside. The shadows from my headlamp shifted over the frost on the walls. I called out for Dan once out of habit, then stopped myself. My voice just sounded wrong in that space, muffled and swallowed by the insulation. When I left the shed, the cold hit like a slap. I trudged back toward the bunkhouse, the snow squeaking under my boots. The metal steps were slick with frost. Inside, the place was quiet except for the buzz of the emergency lights. Dan's bunk was empty. His parka was gone from the hook and his gloves weren't there either. The cigarette tin he always kept on the shelf was missing. I checked the mess hall, the comm room, the small lab, all empty. No footprints around the main buildings except mine. That's when I noticed something through the window. A faint line of snowmobile tracks heading away from the station, out toward the open tundra. I grabbed my spotlight and followed them. The beam cut across the snow like a sword, throwing long shadows over the drifts. The air felt heavy, pressing down in that way it does when it's colder than it should ever be. The tracks were fresh, still sharp-edged, leading north toward the river basin. I walked beside them for a while, my boots sinking into the crust. Every few minutes I stopped to listen, half expecting to hear the faint sound of an engine, but there was nothing. Just the hum of my own breathing inside the mask. After maybe half a mile, the wind started to pick up. Fine snow whipped across the surface, blurring the trail. I kept following it until the beam of my light hit something strange. The tracks just stopped. One moment they were there, 2 clean lines pressed deep into the crust, and the next they ended in a smooth patch of untouched snow. No sign of the snowmobile turning, no drag marks, no footprints. Just gone. I walked around in circles, scanning the area, trying to make sense of it. I thought maybe he'd fallen through the ice somewhere, but the ground there was solid permafrost, hard as concrete. No cracks, no soft spots, nothing. The snowmobile couldn't have sunk. It would have left some mark, but the snow was perfectly smooth, like he'd just lifted off the ground and vanished. I turned off my light for a moment to listen. There was no wind, no sound at all, just that huge empty quiet that makes your heartbeat seem too loud. My breath came out in bursts of white steam, and I could feel frost starting to form around the edge of my mask. I remember thinking about how easy it would be to get lost right there, with no horizon, no stars, just black sky and endless white. I went back to the station and tried the radio, but the signal was weak. The emergency antenna had been icing over for days, and the weather wasn't helping. I finally got a message through to Fairbanks, and they said they'd send a small rescue team up as soon as the weather cleared. That took nearly 2 days. I kept the generator running and stayed awake most of the time, checking the perimeter, walking the same frozen paths just to keep my body from stiffening. I didn't sleep much. Every time I shut my eyes, I'd see that trail ending in nothing. When the rescue team finally arrived, they went over the tracks themselves. They measured the snow depth, took photos, marked GPS points. One of the rangers said maybe Dan had turned back and the tracks filled in from wind, but there wasn't enough drift to hide a machine that heavy. They searched for days, miles of open ground, the frozen river, even the ice ridges farther north. Nothing. They found his snowmobile key still in the ignition back at the garage. That was the part that stuck with me. If he'd taken one of the station sleds, the key wouldn't have been there. He didn't take the snowmobile at all. But the tracks were real. I'd followed them myself. They filed the report as disorientation and exposure, like they always do. They said maybe he walked out there and lost direction in the dark. Maybe he panicked. Maybe he fell. Maybe the snow buried his body overnight. But I don't buy it. Dan knew that terrain too well. He'd been out there for years. And people don't just stop like that. Not in that kind of cold. At those temperatures, your body shuts down fast. Your skin turns glassy. Your breath crystallizes. You don't walk far, but you leave signs, footprints, gear, something. There was nothing. When they finally pulled us out, I was the last one to leave. I shut off the main generator myself, walked through each building one more time. Everything felt hollow, like the station was waiting for something that would never come back. The rescue crew had packed up their gear, and I was alone again, listening to the wind start to rise. Before I boarded the plane, I looked back across the tundra. The snowmobile tracks were still there, frozen solid now, ending out in that empty field of white. The light from the station reflected faintly off them, a thin silver line stretching toward the horizon. I've thought about that scene more times than I can count, how the tracks just stopped, how the cold air swallowed every sound. They say sometimes the tundra plays tricks on you, that the dark and the silence can make your mind bend around itself. Maybe that's true, but I know what I saw, and I know those tracks didn't fade or drift. They ended clean, as if someone had drawn a line and decided that was far enough. Every winter, when I feel that dry cold creep in, I think about Dan standing out there somewhere in the black, just standing, maybe looking back toward the station lights one last time. Whatever happened, he didn't just walk away. Something in that frozen night stopped him, and we never saw him again. The day I reached that stretch of the Naknek River, the light had that washed-out look it gets in late winter, when the sun hangs low and cold. I'd been out for nearly a week, moving cabin to cabin, noting which were salvageable and which were just piles of gray wood ready to fall into the snow. Most were too far gone. My job was simple. Take pictures, mark GPS coordinates, jot down structural notes, and move on. The work was quiet and lonely, but that was fine. Out there, the silence was constant, broken only by the wind or the distant crack of shifting ice. That afternoon, I followed a frozen trail that hugged the riverbank. The kind of narrow track you could tell used to be a road decades ago, before willows started growing through it. The snow was knee-deep, and my snowshoes left wide, deliberate prints. It was around 2 o'clock when I spotted the first roof line through the trees, weathered wood poking up against the pale sky. As I got closer, I realized there wasn't just one cabin, but 4, all arranged in a small half-circle facing the river. The place looked different from the others I'd seen. The walls were intact, roofs straight, windows mostly unbroken. There was a faint feeling of order about it, like someone had cared for the place. At first, I figured maybe some trappers or fishers still used it seasonally. That happened sometimes. Folks built up these old cabins again to use during runs, but something about it made me pause. I saw footprints right away, fresh ones. They weren't old, wind-blown hollows, but crisp impressions leading between the cabins. The firewood pile next to the nearest one was neat, and some logs had been split recently. The axe leaned against the stump, blade half buried in frozen bark. There was even a faint black smear on one stovepipe, like it had seen smoke not long ago. I remember standing there for a minute, listening. The only sound was the soft creaking of a half-frozen branch nearby. I called out once, just a simple, "Hello," but my voice didn't carry far. The air swallowed it, dead and cold. No movement, no response. I tried again, louder this time, but still nothing. It was strange because everything suggested someone had been there that morning, or maybe even still was. I decided to take a look inside, thinking maybe someone was hurt or just out checking traps. The biggest cabin sat slightly above the others, facing the river directly. The door was half open. Snow drifted in along the threshold. Inside, it felt like walking into a place that someone had just stepped away from for a moment. 2 enamel mugs sat on the table, both half full. The coffee inside frozen solid. There were sleeping bags unrolled on the bunks, still slightly puffed up. A small kerosene lamp sat on the counter with the wick burnt low, and beside it, an open can of beans with a spoon stuck in. It was eerie in its ordinariness, like time had paused in the middle of a morning routine. The floorboards creaked when I stepped farther in, and I remember that dry, dusty smell of old wood mixed with cold air. On one wall, a calendar from 1983 still hung, pages curled and yellowed. Someone had circled dates all the way through February, then nothing. I took pictures, my gloves stiff on the camera buttons, and made notes about the structure. Everything was in surprisingly good condition. No major rot, a solid roof, windows intact. But the signs of recent activity didn't make sense. When I stepped back outside, the wind had picked up a little, and something caught my eye. All 4 cabins had their doors open. Every single one, swinging lightly on the hinges. I was sure they hadn't all been that way when I arrived. At least 1 or 2 had looked closed. I scanned the ground again. The snow around the cabins was marked with all sorts of tracks, boot prints mostly. Some overlapping, some fading into the wind. I followed them to the edge of the river, which was frozen solid, a white sheet stretching as far as I could see downstream. The prints went straight onto the ice. 5, maybe 6 sets of them. They were clear and spaced evenly, as if a small group had walked out in a line. I followed them for about 30 yards, the ice cracking faintly under my boots. Then just like that, they stopped. The last footprints ended abruptly midstream. No turnaround marks, no scatter of snow, no sign of a hole or weak ice, just gone, as if they'd walked out there and vanished into thin air. I crouched and ran a glove across the last print. It was crisp, not even softened by the wind yet. It couldn't have been more than a day old. The sky had that dim, gray look that told me I didn't have much daylight left, and the feeling in my gut was off. Uneasy in a way I couldn't explain. I backed up slowly toward the bank, keeping my eyes on those footprints and then on the cabins. The wind blew through again, pushing one of the doors hard enough to slam it against the wall with a hollow thud. That sound echoed down the frozen river, sharp and hollow. I remember feeling exposed, like something was watching from the tree line even though I saw nothing but willows and snow. I went back to my snowmobile, about 100 yards up the path, and got on the radio. The signal was spotty, but I managed to reach the dispatcher. I told them I'd found a settlement that seemed to be in use and described what I saw. The tracks, the open cabins, the frozen coffee cups. There was a long pause on the other end, just static crackling. Then the dispatcher said the coordinates I'd given matched a known site, but that it had been abandoned since the mid-1980s. They said no one lived there anymore, not officially. They didn't have any record of current permits or leases in that area. I repeated what I saw, but the reply didn't change. No one had any reason to be there. I remember looking around while holding the radio, half expecting to see someone walking toward me, maybe one of the supposed residents coming back, but there was only the low moan of wind moving across the river. I stayed long enough to mark everything properly in my notes and take more photos, though I kept glancing back toward the water every few seconds. I didn't like turning my back to it. The footprints seemed wrong somehow, the way they stopped. It felt like there was an explanation right beyond reach, but none of it fit. Before leaving, I checked the cabins one last time. Inside the biggest one, I noticed something I hadn't before. A pair of gloves sitting neatly by the door, palms facing up like someone had just taken them off. The stove door was open too. Ashes inside still faintly clumped as if they'd cooled recently. I ran a finger through and felt a trace of warmth, but maybe it was just my imagination. The walls creaked softly as the wind pressed against them, and a few snowflakes drifted through the cracked window. I closed the door on my way out and latched it, just out of habit, though the others stayed open. I rode out of there fast, following my own tracks back through the trees until the settlement was out of sight. I didn't stop until I reached the highway an hour later. When I filed my report, I included all the photos, footprints, cabins, even the frozen mugs. The department later confirmed again that the place hadn't been occupied for over 30 years. They sent another team out a week later to verify the condition. When they came back, they said the same cabins were there, but all the doors were shut, no tracks, no firewood, no cups, nothing to suggest anyone had been there in years. I still think about that site sometimes. I know what I saw. The footprints, the warmth in the stove, the smell of burnt coffee in the air. I don't believe in ghosts or anything like that, but I can't explain how a place could feel that alive and still be empty. Maybe someone had been squatting there and took off the night before. Maybe the tracks were older than I thought, preserved by the cold. But even that doesn't explain how they just ended in the middle of the river. Every year when I'm back in that area, I pass by the old trail that leads down to those cabins. I never take it again. From the ridge, I can still see the roofs through the trees, small and dark against the ice. Even from a distance, the doors look open. Maybe it's just the angle, maybe it's memory, but I swear they still swing a little when the wind blows up the river. We started our winter trek through the Kontishna Hills in mid-February of 2015. The forecast had looked bad, but we were prepared for cold. I was with two others, Mark and Elliot. Both were experienced climbers, older than me, calm under pressure. We'd planned a 5-day route through the valleys north of Wonder Lake, aiming to loop back toward the park road. It wasn't extreme mountaineering, just an ambitious winter crossing. The temperature hovered around 20 degrees the first day, with the kind of stillness that only Alaska in deep winter has. Every sound seemed muffled by the snow. By the second evening, the weather had shifted hard. The clouds rolled in over the hills like smoke, thick and low, and by nightfall the wind picked up to a steady howl. The snow started blowing sideways. We found what looked like a low, sheltered depression between two rises, what seemed like a smart choice at the time, and set up our tents. The snow was already waist-deep, so we packed it down with our snowshoes before pitching the tents. We anchored every line, double-checked the zippers, and crawled inside. The wind shook the nylon walls so violently that it sounded like we were inside a drum. Inside, the cold crept in fast. We cooked a quick meal with the stove half buried in the vestibule, eating freeze-dried food with stiff hands. My breath froze to the inside of the tent, making a layer of frost that sparkled when I shone my headlamp around. Mark and I shared a tent. Elliot took the other one a few yards away. We said goodnight through the wind, zipped everything tight, and tried to sleep. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to the tent walls slapping my face. The wind was hammering the ridge above us, making a strange, low hum like a deep vibration through the snow. The air inside felt colder than before, sharp and biting. I burrowed deeper into my sleeping bag, listened to the storm rage, and drifted in and out of half-sleep. At around 4 a.m., I woke up again, this time from the cold. Not just regular cold, but the kind that crawls under your skin. My face hurt from it. I reached up to zip the hood of my bag tighter and noticed a faint draft on my face. I turned on my headlamp, and that's when I saw it. The tent flap was open. Not just unzipped, but flapping slightly in the wind. For a few seconds, I just stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My brain was foggy from sleep in the cold. I sat up confused, expecting to see Mark adjusting something or coming back from outside. But he wasn't there. His sleeping bag was half unzipped and empty. His boots, gloves, parka, all of it were still inside the tent. I said his name quietly, then louder. Nothing. The only sound was the wind screaming through the valley. I crawled to the entrance and pulled it open wider. My headlamp beam cut through the swirling snow, revealing a blur of white and movement. Then I saw faint depressions in the snow, footprints, bare footprints. They led away from the tent in a straight line. At first, I thought maybe he'd gone to check on Elliot, but the direction didn't match. His tracks led out into open space away from both tents, straight toward the rise beyond the valley. No staggering, no hesitation. Just a clean line of prints spaced evenly like he'd walked out calmly. I hesitated. My first instinct was to zip the tent shut and wait for daylight, but something about seeing those prints in the snow pulled at me. I couldn't leave him out there. Not in that weather. I pulled on my parka and boots, grabbed my headlamp, and stepped out. The cold hit me like a slap. The air was full of fine, blowing snow, the kind that sticks to your eyelashes and makes it hard to see. I leaned into the wind and started following the tracks. The snow was already filling them in, but I could still make out the faint outlines. They were small and precise, leading straight ahead for maybe 50 yards. My light beam kept flickering as the wind battered it. But I followed the line step by step, my boots crunching through the crust. The snow was knee-deep in some spots, and my breath came out in sharp bursts. Then my light caught something ahead, a dark shape half buried in the blowing snow. I slowed down, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. When I got closer, I realized it was him, Mark. He was standing upright, maybe 10 feet in front of me, not moving. Snow was caked along his shoulders and back, forming a white crust that blended him into the storm. His arm was raised slightly, bent at the elbow, as if he'd tried to block his face from something. His other arm hung limp at his side. His head was tilted downward, chin almost touching his chest. I called his name, but the wind swallowed it instantly. I took another step closer, shining the light directly at him. His eyes were open. His face was pale, lips cracked, eyelashes crusted with frost. He looked like he'd frozen mid-motion. For a moment I didn't understand, didn't want to understand. I reached out, brushed snow off his sleeve. His skin beneath the thin layer of frost was solid, unyielding. He was frozen stiff. I stumbled back a few steps, heart pounding, my breath loud inside my hood. The snow was coming down so thick I could barely see more than a few feet ahead. I turned and started back toward the tents, following my own boot prints, my headlamp beam bouncing wildly as I half ran through the drifts. When I reached camp, I unzipped Elliot's tent and shouted for him. He sat up fast, groggy and disoriented, blinking against the light. I told him what I'd found, what I'd seen, and we both threw on our gear and went back out. But by then the tracks were almost gone. The wind had erased everything. We searched with our lights for over an hour, shouting his name into the storm until the cold forced us back inside. The blizzard lasted 2 more days. We were trapped there, the tents half buried by snow. We used the stove sparingly, rationing fuel, listening to the wind hammer the valley. When it finally eased, we broke camp and marked the spot with a flag before making the slow trek back toward the ranger station. It took them 3 days to reach the site after we reported it. By then, everything had changed. The area where I'd seen him standing was buried under several feet of snow. They probed the area, eventually finding his body a few feet below the surface. The rangers said he probably wandered off delirious from hypothermia, a common thing in extreme cold. People sometimes strip off clothing, walk away from shelter, even smile before they freeze. They called it paradoxical undressing, part of the final stages of cold confusion. But I couldn't make sense of that. There had been no sign of panic, no random wandering. His footprints had been straight, purposeful, like he knew exactly where he was going. And his boots, his gloves, they were still sitting neatly beside his sleeping bag. The rangers logged it as an accident. They said the valley might have channeled wind in a way that pulled open the tent flap, and that he probably woke disoriented and stepped out before realizing what he was doing. I agreed out loud, but inside I didn't. I'd seen the look on his face, frozen solid in that posture, one arm half raised, like he'd been bracing against something that wasn't wind. They airlifted his body out by helicopter. Elliot and I waited with the gear until they were done, standing in silence as the rotor wash scattered snow across the camp. When the sound faded, the valley was still again, just white and endless in every direction. I packed up my tent last. The flap was frozen stiff, the zipper iced over. When I finally got it shut, I stared at the spot where the prints had once been, now smooth and untouched. That night, back at the ranger station, I couldn't sleep. The sound of the wind against the windows brought it all back. The draft on my face, the open flap, the way those tracks led away without hesitation. They said he walked out barefoot into the storm, steady and straight. And I believe that. What I don't understand is why. I was staying in a friend's off-grid cabin on the south side of Kachemak Bay, across the water from Homer. The place sat back in a little clearing, maybe 50 yards from the beach, surrounded by spruce and alder so thick you could hardly see 10 feet in. My friend had built it himself years ago. 1 room, a small loft, a propane stove, and a wood burner that popped and cracked all night. There was no road, no power, no cell service. You had to come by skiff from town, about 10 miles across the bay. Once you were dropped off, you were on your own until someone came back for you. I thought that was part of the charm when I first agreed to stay there for a few days. It was early February, cold and still, with heavy snow coming down most of the day. By the time I got there, the sky was already turning gray. The water was calm, the kind of flat silver you only get before a snowstorm. My friend who owned the place couldn't come with me, but he told me how to get the generator started, if I needed lights, and where to find the extra propane and firewood. I unloaded what I brought, a few bags of groceries, a rifle, and some winter clothes, then watched the skiff turn back across the bay until it disappeared into the mist. The first night was quiet. The kind of quiet that presses on your ears after a while. I made soup, kept the stove burning, and sat at the little window looking out over the snow until I got tired enough to climb into the sleeping bag. The cabin creaked in the wind, and every so often a clump of snow slid off the roof. Nothing felt strange about it, just winter silence and a steady hiss from the stove. The second night, I woke up around midnight to a bright flash of light. It took me a second to realize the motion sensor outside had tripped. The light shone through the cracks around the window frame, cutting the darkness inside the cabin. I sat up, heart beating a little faster, listening. I thought maybe it was snow falling off the eaves or an animal. I got up and looked out. The air was full of slow-falling snow, thick flakes tumbling down through the cone of light. There was nothing else there. No movement, no tracks I could see. After a minute, the light went off and the cabin was dark again. I lay back down, trying to ignore it, but every few hours the light would flick on again. Each time I looked, I saw the same thing. Snow falling, nothing moving. The light was only supposed to trigger if something crossed in front of it, but I told myself it could be wind, or maybe ice shifting on the sensor. Still, it felt strange that it kept happening through the night, almost on a pattern. Around dawn, I finally got up, made coffee, and decided to step outside to see if anything was there. When I opened the door, the snow came up past my ankles. The air was heavy and still, the kind of cold that stung your nose when you breathed. Right away, I saw them. Fresh boot prints pressed clean into the snow, leading out from the trees at the back of the clearing. They circled the cabin in a slow, looping path, close enough that whoever it was must have looked right through the windows. I followed them around to the other side and saw where they stopped directly beneath the window by my bed. The tracks turned, went back past the woodpile, and disappeared toward the beach. They weren't mine, and they weren't my friends. I knew that immediately. His boots left a wide square tread, and these were narrower, deeper, maybe from someone heavier. The stride was long, too, like whoever made them wasn't stumbling or lost. They knew exactly where they were going. I stood there a long time, just staring at those prints. The woods beyond the clearing were quiet, but that kind of quiet didn't feel right anymore. It felt like something was out there, just watching. I followed the tracks partway down toward the cove. They ended where the snow turned to a thin layer of slush near the waterline. I looked out across the bay, but everything was fog and snow. There were no boats, no sound of engines, nothing. All day I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me sleep. I checked the windows, made sure the door was locked, and even brought the rifle inside from the rack. The snow fell heavier that afternoon, and by dark the prints were half buried. I built a bigger fire, kept the lights low, and sat by the window with the rifle on my knees. The air outside looked thick and gray. Around midnight, the motion light flicked on again. This time I didn't move. I just watched the pale glow stretch across the clearing through the frost on the window. It stayed on for maybe 30 seconds before going dark again. My chest was tight. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a fox or a lynx, but I'd seen those tracks before and they weren't shaped like boots. I waited, staring out the window until the cold from the glass made my forehead ache. Around 2 a.m., I heard it. Slow, heavy breathing right outside the wall. Not footsteps, not wind, just breathing. Deep, steady, like someone trying to stay quiet but too close to hide the sound. I held the rifle and aimed it toward the window, squinting into the dark. The motion light hadn't triggered yet, and the only thing I could see was a faint outline of trees through the fog. My pulse was pounding in my ears. The breathing stopped, and for a second I thought maybe I'd imagined it. Then something brushed against the side of the cabin, a soft dragging sound like a sleeve or a shoulder sliding along the wood. I clicked off the safety on the rifle and waited. When I couldn't take it anymore, I swung open the door and pointed the gun out into the fog. The light came on instantly, flooding the snow in front of the cabin. Nothing moved. The prints were there again, though, fresh ones, crisp in the snow, leading from the window to the tree line. I followed them only a few yards this time before turning back. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely close the door. The rest of the night I sat in the chair facing the window, waiting for the light to come on again. But it didn't. It stayed dark and silent until dawn. When the first gray light showed through the fog, I finally went outside again. The snow had crusted over, and the prints from the night before stood out cleanly, frozen at the edges. I followed them all the way down to the cove, and that's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Drag marks through the snow, like a small skiff had been pulled up onto the beach sometime during the night. There were boot prints all around it, the same tread I'd seen before. They led from the skiff toward the cabin, then back again. The boat itself was gone, just faint grooves in the sand where it had been. I stood there for a long time, staring out across the bay. The fog was lifting now, sunlight spilling through in thin streaks. Far out, near the middle of the water, I thought I saw the faint shape of a small boat moving away, barely more than a speck against the glare. It could have been anyone, but I had no doubt it was the same person who'd been walking around the cabin. When I finally packed up to leave later that morning, I kept glancing at the woods, half expecting to see someone standing there. The air was still, but it didn't feel empty. I left the firewood stacked, shut the shutters, and locked the door. As I walked down to where my ride would pick me up later that day, I couldn't stop thinking about how quiet the night had been before the breathing started. How whoever it was had come across 10 miles of open bay in a snowstorm, pulled up in the dark, and walked straight to the cabin like they already knew it was there. I never found out who it was. My friend said nobody lived on that side of the bay anymore. Not for years. When I told him about the footprints and the missing skiff, he just went quiet for a while, then said it was probably someone checking on cabins for supplies during the winter. Maybe that's all it was, but I remember the sound of that breathing through the wall. Slow, careful, human, and the way the prints had stopped just under the window by my bed. That was the last night I ever stayed out there alone. I rented the Forest Service cabin on a Klutna Lake for the weekend because I needed to get away from people. I'd been working too much, sleeping too little, and I wanted 2 quiet days with no signal, no noise, no one around. The cabin was about 1.5 miles from the parking lot, tucked in the woods on the north side of the lake. It was early winter, maybe late November. The forecast said mild snow, around 25 degrees at night, cold but manageable. I hiked in around 4 in the afternoon. The air was still, no wind, just the crunch of my boots on the packed trail. The snow was thin enough that I could see patches of brown leaves frozen beneath the white. The sun was already dropping behind the Chugach Mountains, and the light had that dim blue tint that always makes the forest feel older than it really is. My pack was heavy with firewood, food, and a small hatchet I'd brought just in case. When I reached the cabin, I felt good. It was small but solid, made of dark logs with a metal roof, and the Forest Service had stocked it with a few bundles of wood. There was a little porch out front, a single window facing the lake, and a rusty stovepipe jutting from the roof. Inside, it smelled like wood smoke and old pine. The log walls had carvings from past visitors, names, dates, short messages scratched into the wood. I dropped my pack, unpacked my sleeping bag, and lit the stove. It took a while for the fire to catch, but once it did, the cabin filled with the familiar dry heat that comes from burning spruce. I cooked a small meal on my camp stove, just rice and sausage, and sat by the window watching the lake fade into darkness. By 5:30 it was pitch black, the kind of darkness that seems to press right up against the glass, thick and heavy. There was no wind, no sound outside. Even the lake seemed frozen in silence. Every now and then, I'd hear the faint crack of ice shifting, like something deep below the surface moving in its sleep. I stayed up until about 9, reading by lantern light, then crawled into my sleeping bag. Sometime after midnight, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. The fire had burned down to coals, and the cabin was dimly lit by their dull orange glow. I lay there half asleep when I heard it. The sound of something dragging along the outside wall, slow scraping steady, like a stick or branch being pulled against the logs. It started near the back corner of the cabin and moved along the wall toward the front. I thought it might be the wind, but when I sat up and listened, there was no gust, no movement in the trees, just that dry, deliberate scraping. I reached for my flashlight, my hands clumsy from sleep, and shined it toward the window. The beam cut through the frost on the glass and caught nothing but snow and trees. The noise stopped as soon as I moved. I stayed like that for a while, listening. My heart was pounding, and every small sound in the cabin, the faint ticking of cooling metal. The shift of the wood in the stove made me tense up. After a few minutes of silence, I told myself it was just a branch that had loosened and was rubbing in the wind. I tried to lie back down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The kind of feeling that crawls up your spine and sits in your chest, making every breath feel too loud. Then it started again, this time from the opposite side of the cabin. The same dragging sound moving low along the wall, like whoever or whatever was doing it wanted me to hear. My first thought was a bear, maybe one that smelled the food I'd cooked earlier. But bears should have been mostly denned up by then. And besides, it didn't sound like claws. It sounded intentional. I got up, grabbed my flashlight again, and stepped quietly to the window on that side. My breath fogged the glass before I could see through it. I wiped it with my sleeve and looked out. The light from the beam caught only falling snow, tiny flakes drifting down in slow motion. No movement, no sound now. Just the empty forest, I shouted. Half to scare off an animal, half to convince myself there was a normal explanation. "Hey!" My voice cracked from how dry the air was. The sound echoed faintly into the trees, and then there was nothing. Not even a bird or squirrel stirred. Just dead silence pressing in on all sides. I sat awake for the rest of the night, listening. Every small creak made me flinch. I didn't build the fire back up. I didn't want any extra noise that could drown out something moving outside. I just sat on the edge of my sleeping bag, flashlight in my hand, waiting for the sound to come back. It didn't. When daylight finally came, it was a pale gray morning. My neck was stiff, my eyes burning from staying awake. I opened the door slowly, half expecting something to dart away, but all I saw was snow still falling lightly. I stepped out onto the porch. The air was cold enough to sting my nose. The trees were still. The lake was a flat sheet of ice, smooth and faintly blue under the sky. Then I saw the prints. They started near the tree line and came right up to the side of the cabin. Bare footprints. Human. Not boots, not shoes. Bare feet pressed into the thin layer of snow. They circled the entire cabin. I walked around slowly, following them, my breath shaking in the cold air. Whoever it was had walked all the way around, stopping at each wall. The prints overlapped in some places, like they'd made more than one pass. I knelt down to look closer. The shape was unmistakable. 5 toes, a heel, an arch, but the skin looked torn. The edges of the prints were streaked with darker spots, faint traces of what could only be blood frozen into the snow. The footprints led away from the cabin into the woods, but faded after a few yards, lost in the powder. I felt a kind of cold I can't describe then. Not from the air, but from realizing I'd been awake in that cabin all night, while someone barefoot and bleeding walked circles around it. I checked the window frames, the door latch, even the wood near the base of the walls. On the far side, where I'd first heard the noise, I found faint scuff marks, small grooves that lined up with the sound I'd heard. It hadn't been a branch. Something had dragged a stick or maybe a piece of wood across the wall deliberately. I went back inside, my hands shaking, and started packing my gear. I didn't eat breakfast. I didn't clean up the cabin like I usually would. I left the rest of the firewood stacked in the corner, and the sleeping bag still half unrolled. By the time I stepped off the porch, the prints were already being softened by fresh snow, slowly disappearing like they'd never been there. The trail back felt longer than it had on the way in. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone walking behind me through the trees. The forest was quiet, too quiet, like everything in it was waiting for me to leave. When I reached the parking lot, my truck was the only one there. The windows were frosted over, and I had to scrape them just to see out. I sat there for a while with the heater blasting, watching the snow drift down, and tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was someone camping illegally nearby, someone who'd lost their mind or gotten stranded. Maybe it was someone testing if the cabin was occupied, hoping to steal supplies. I don't know, but I do know what I saw. The shape of those feet, the torn skin, the frozen spots of blood, they were real. And whoever left them had walked barefoot through snow at 25 degrees, circling a stranger's cabin in the middle of the night. I never reported it. I told myself there was no point, but I haven't gone back to Eclatna Lake since. Sometimes, though, when the nights get quiet enough, I still hear that dragging sound in my head, the slow, steady scrape of something circling just outside the wall.